Welcome to Clear the Air with me, Angela Lim, medical doctor and co-founder of ClearHead, an innovative employee wellbeing platform. Clear the Air is a podcast covering those experiences in your life or questions you have that you feel too vulnerable to share with those around you, such as, why do I feel so lonely? And what can I do to feel happier? We get real and raw on these existential questions on mental health and well-being that's puzzled humans for millennia, sharing the science behind what you're experiencing and the answers behind those questions. Understanding and embracing neurodiversity is more important than ever, especially as workplaces strive to be more inclusive, supportive, and innovative. Autism, often misunderstood or overlooked, brings with it unique perspectives and strengths that can greatly enrich a team when supported effectively. In this episode, we're going to be joined by Larah and Chanelle from Autism New Zealand, who will share their lived experience and professional insights on how to support autistic individuals in the workplace, from recruitment and onboarding all the way through to everyday communication and collaboration. Whether you're an HR leader, manager, or teammate, this session will offer practical tools and a deeper understanding on how to build a workplace where autistic employees feel valued, understood, and empowered to thrive. Now, welcoming our speakers, Larah. Larah is the Research and Advocacy Manager at Autism New Zealand, where she has worked for the past 6 years. She is also an Adjunct Research Fellow at Victoria University of Wellington. Larah is passionate about inclusion and making a positive difference to the autistic community, both at an individual level and in creating systemic change. Chanelle is a neurodivergent person who is autistic, dyslexic, and has ADHD, along with pathological demand avoidance. They have worked as a research and advocacy advisor and has written and illustrated 2 books on neurodivergence, one of which was listed for the New Zealand Book Awards. Chanelle was diagnosed in adulthood and is very passionate about creating more inclusive and understanding communities. Welcome, Larah and Chanelle.
Kia ora, thank you.
Well, maybe to kick us off, we should all be on the same page about what is autism. Would you like to provide us a definition, how common it is in the community, and maybe we can go from there?
Sure. Yeah, so autism is a neurodevelopmental condition. It's a diverse spectrum that affects the way people think, feel, and perceive the world. And generally, it's estimated that about 2 or 3% of the population are autistic. So in Aotearoa, we estimate around 160,000 New Zealanders are autistic. And when we're looking at unemployment for autistic people is about 2 times the rate of other disability categories, or 6 times the rate of people without a disability. In one of our recent surveys, we found that about 1/3 of the autistic adults responding to this survey were unemployed.
You know, one of the things that you haven't quite sort of talked about in your definition is this idea about the diversity of autism. And sometimes it can be easy to think about it in the context of, oh, how severe is this person's autism? But that's not how you like to define it.
So autism is a spectrum, but that spectrum is not linear. It's not more autistic, less autistic, mild, severe, high functioning, low functioning. The autism spectrum is more like a circle or a series of linear spectrums where every autistic person has different experiences with different traits, and those traits can vary day to day or in different contexts or over time. It does also mean that you're not everyone is on the spectrum. You're either autistic or you're not. And it varies quite significantly. So for me, I can do these talks. I'm quite fine. Sometimes I can't talk at all. So very different person to person, very different across life.
So you're saying that, that diversity of how it manifests can even vary day to day, in addition to person.
Yeah. And instead of saying, high functioning or low functioning or talking about severity, we talk about people's support needs. So there might be high support needs or low support needs. It's quite complex. So being high functioning doesn't simply translate to low support needs.
Yeah, it's about looking at those, the individual needs and those kind of core areas that might be impacting that person. So whether that's, communication, executive functioning, sensory sensitivities.
Yeah,
that would be kind of the key sorts of areas we're often talking about, right?
Yeah, so an example is with previous definitions, I would be considered high functioning because I present in a way that is comfortable for everyone around me. But I can't cook a meal by myself. I can't clean my own room. I struggle with day-to-day tasks, even though I thrive in other areas of my life.
And along those lines, where I guess does that responsibility lie in allowing an individual to know whether they're high support need or low support need, where to get those support? As you mentioned, it can be quite different.
I guess it's that challenge because
not everyone knows what their needs are or what counts as a need, or I think generally we would consider someone high support needs if they're not able to do anything independently or need a lot more help to communicate. But being high support needs doesn't mean you can't do anything. We have high support needs people who manage really well in employment and low support needs people who can't manage employment. So it's very, very different depending on the person and what exactly they struggle with.
Interesting. You mentioned that sometimes part of that complexity is people won't know what needs that they have. Does that mean that the best place to go is to see a doctor, or what's the best path, as they sort of start that journey around getting the support that they need?
Talking to other autistic people. Yeah, it can be hard to identify sometimes. Something we come up on quite often is if we ask people if they struggle with showering, they'll say no, they just don't do it. So they are struggling with it, but they don't classify it that way, and that can happen with a few things. The other thing is if autistic people interact with other autistic people, a lot of the social difficulties disappear, and so they would say they don't have social challenges, but in a neurotypical setting they might.
Yes, definitely a lot of complexity. So I think you're really making the case early for what it means to be as part of a community, because even informally knowing how to navigate the world requires a little bit of understanding of you don't know what you don't know kind of thing. There's, as we talked about terminology, there's still a lot of confusion, I guess, in that context. One of the things that we spoke about was differentiating this terminology between saying autistic, which is more what you define as identity first, versus a person with autism, which is more person first. Can you maybe clarify what the community prefers, and what do you feel what's the difference between identity first versus person first?
So the majority of the autistic community prefer identity first, so autistic, over person first or person with autism. And there's a few reasons around that. One is that person-first language is the kind of language we use for illnesses or diseases or things we want to cure. So a person with cancer rather than a cancerous person. It also kind of implies that it's separate from you, like you're carrying it like a handbag or living with it like a flatmate. But autism impacts every part of who a person is. I cannot separate my autism from myself. It impacts how I think, how I feel, how I understand everything around me, my senses, my movement. I am autistic. I can't remove that from me and put it aside and, distinguish different parts of who I am.
And with that, that's the kind of the majority preference, but it is always important to understand each individual's preferences, and there might be, variation in that. We, Autism New Zealand, worked with our advisory group and autistic advisors in developing a whole autism terminology resource, which gets into a lot more of the kind of the detail of that. So, if that's something that people are interested in, it's definitely worth having a look to get more of that kind of insight and around, the various different terms associated with autism as well.
And I guess what we've been kind of discussing on is, in some ways, you could say a little bit of a deficit model. We're sort of saying that a person is struggling with all these things. They have all these support needs. But what's a strength-based terminology that you would suggest to improve the narrative?
I think when we start moving away from referring to it as deficits and start moving towards differences, it helps be more inclusive in society. So instead of saying autistic people struggle with social interaction, it's autistic people have differences in the way they interact. And that changes it from something that needs to be fixed with that person to accepting that they might just do things differently and understanding what that is.
I mean, we've talked about it very much in this very dry, definition perspective. It'd be great to hear from your, what would you say are the key differences that someone who is autistic would be from someone who's neurotypical that people can keep an eye out on?
So communication is a big one. A lot of autistic people can be quite literal or very direct. So there's a mismatch in terms of communication that can lead to frustration and misunderstanding. That also has an impact on social interactions. Sensory differences. So a lot of autistic people can have heightened senses and hear a lot more than the average person, or they can be sensory seeking. So they might like to move around a lot more, or they might walk on their toes. But it varies quite a lot. Some might not be able to speak. Stimming is quite a common one. You might see people flapping their hands or twirling their hair or tapping, fidgeting.
What are the challenges even with getting a formal diagnosis, and how is Autism New Zealand sort of reviewing the barriers that exist and how to improve it?
I think a diagnosis is a really important part of that journey, but it doesn't necessarily need to be a formal diagnosis. There's a lot of people that self-diagnose, and that has the same sort of, it can have the same sort of impact, same positive impact on their lives. But in terms of that formal diagnosis, it can be a challenging journey for people in terms of access and in terms of kind of the consistency in the way autism is diagnosed across the country. So in the public system, it can be difficult to access the public system. So for children, the wait lists are really long, and for adults seeking a diagnosis, it's pretty much just about impossible to get a diagnosis through the public system. And so then you're looking at private. Private is costly, and so it can be prohibitive in that way, but also there's huge wait times in private practice these days as well. So Autism New Zealand, a number of years ago, did quite a bit of research around understanding the diagnostic process across the country, looking at that access, but then also how the diagnosis is made and how that can actually vary quite considerably. And so with that, we are obviously always trying to advocate to government to improve that access and also that consistency in how autism is diagnosed. And we also set up our own small diagnostic service. So we have a small diagnostic service here in Wellington. And a key part of that was also changing the way that we're looking at diagnosis, so it's not so medicalised and deficit focused, and actually does take more of that kind of strengths-based approach. So it doesn't actually have to be a really traumatic experience either, that it's really helping the person and the family around themselves better understand themselves.
Good to know that even a self-diagnosis is helpful in some cases as well, especially in the context that if you can't get a formal diagnosis. I also want to mention that, Clearhead's an EAP provider. We do have clinicians on our platform that can provide diagnosis for neurodiversity, including autism, ADHD. So being able to think about maybe potentially your workplace as another source of where to get funded support if you're not getting through the public system or you're not able to self-fund is really important to not struggle, or in some workplaces have very inclusive employees benefits. So that's something you think about. And so I guess transitioning to sort of that workplace situation where workplace could do more in supporting the community. If, for example, we just say that someone was able to get a formal diagnosis, is that something that you would recommend that they share, even just as part of the recruitment process? Be great to kind of hear a little bit about what you advocate as a ideal journey for an individual who is autistic, going through the workplace, starting from recruitment.
Disclosure is a choice. Not everyone wants to disclose or should disclose. No one should have to disclose to be accommodated. The thing is that as a society, we're not quite at a place where it's always safe for people to identify, and it's very easy to be pushed out of getting employment if someone knows that you're autistic or you disclose too soon. We'll get more into that as we talk, but it's very much a personal decision that could have significant consequences.
Yeah, and that's where it's so important to be, supporting that understanding so that it becomes more of a safe place where people can feel like they are able to disclose, and that disclosing is a positive thing and a helpful thing in their employment.
Along those lines, what are the signs for an autistic person to kind of look out for to know whether it is a safe space to disclose?
Language used, I suppose, is one thing. Another is if they have fidget toys out, you kind of get a little bit of an idea that they're a bit more understanding. Giving very clear information, accounting for communication preferences. Maybe they don't always communicate best over the phone. They might need things in writing. Following up phone calls with emails so that it's sent both ways. Just generally, I think being understanding that people might have differences.
Yeah, and I think if you're in your workplace and see that they can be quite flexible and to take into consideration each individual's different sorts of needs, and make different sorts of accommodations or do differently for different employees, then you'd be feeling like you're more safe to disclose and then to see, whether there are any accommodations or things that could be put in place for yourself.
If you shouldn't have to disclose to get accommodations, how would you suggest a person gets accommodations at work? We often suggest that workplaces have checklists of accommodations that everyone can choose from, because accommodations do help everyone. It's not just disabled people. So we kind of suggest offering things up front so people know what they can choose from.
I think that's such a great proactive way a workplace can think about, as you said, accommodating not just autistic people, but everyone who, whether you're on the spectrum or not, will generally communicate a little bit differently, will prefer slightly different ways of working. So what are common accommodations that you would suggest should be on a checklist?
So for me, I spent a long time trying to get a job, wasn't able to access the workforce. For me, I needed certain things like accommodations for my sensory side of things. There's a lot of jobs that I just would not be able to manage in because they're so overstimulating. So dress codes is one. I think sometimes we should probably consider the reason behind dress codes. I think sometimes there can be a little bit of leeway. Hours of work was one. For me, I need to be able to work flexibly because I can get overstimulated and overwhelmed, and in those times, I'm not going to be working productively and efficiently. So I work a set number of hours a week, but I can work that at any point. It doesn't have to be between 9 to 5. It doesn't have to be on the same days every week. Just as long as I'm getting my work done on time, it's not really a problem. Here at Autism New Zealand, we generally do low sensory, so we don't have music going. We don't have strong smelling perfumes or strong scented cleaning products.
Got adjustable lighting.
Yeah, adjustable lighting. If people are having strong smelling foods, they'll ask everyone around them if it's okay to have it at their desk first or if they'll go have it somewhere else. Communication is a big one. Being clear about what it is you're expecting with Larah's my manager, with my tasks, we'll have our meetings, and then that will be followed up with a list in some form, whether that's on Trello or emails, so that I know what tasks I'm meant to be doing and what my priority is. Very just accommodating different communication preferences. Sometimes people might not like talking over the phone and they might need it in writing. Scheduling meetings early in the morning so that it doesn't disrupt you later in the day.
That's a really good start. So you're suggesting that, for example, as part of, for example, maybe induction, a workplace have a checklist, for example. Do you need accommodation on your hours? Do you need accommodation on your dress code? And then people tick it, and then that's a conversation to be had on what that accommodation looks like for that individual. Is that right?
And obviously it varies workplace to workplace. So in our situation, in the roles that we have, there's a lot more flexibility, whereas in some workplaces there isn't that same level of flexibility, but it's still important, like having that kind of a checklist and conversation and approach to look at, and then kind of, I guess, problem solve or think through different things that are actually possible within, the restraints of the role.
Along those lines, which you've acknowledged, is that Autism New Zealand, for example, is slightly more accommodating, slightly more flexible than potentially most other workplaces. How do you deal with a workplace that is quite inflexible?
I guess it's tricky because that can vary so much. It depends on the role. There might be some where, like Chanelle was saying before, it's kind of thinking about, why is this the way it is in our workplace? Like, is it something that we could be flexible on, say like hours or an
example
code.
With like dress code, for example, is the police in their FIU had a rule that you couldn't wear hoodies. And when I kind of fleshed it out a bit with them, they said that the rule was because you have to be able to see your face when walking around. And I said, well, why don't you just write that the rule is you can wear hoodies as long as your face is visible? It's really considering what is the reasoning behind the inflexibility of your workplace.
Yeah. But, if it's more, say, like in a hospital or shift-based or things where there's not that same sort of flexibility because you have to be there for those hours and you're, interacting with people, it's about then, okay, well, what other accommodations could we be looking at in terms of especially the environment to make sure that it's not as stimulating to support that kind of sustained work and interaction?
So in that setting, for example, you might need a bit more understanding that for an autistic person, having earplugs doesn't stop them from being able to hear things. They can still have conversations. Obviously, when you're working with patients, you've got to be careful that you're not looking like you're ignoring them, but there are options that are not particularly visible and don't look like earplugs. So I think, having that understanding is helpful.
Yeah, I think what I'm really hearing from you is some workplaces have done the work around building that accommodation and flexibility. And for other workplaces who may not maybe be as far along on the journey, a good way to start is just asking why something is the way they are. So why does the hours have to be 9 to 5? Oh, it's because XYZ. And then sometimes that can be where that conversation around flexibility can start, rather than just being a hard rule of, no, we have to be 9 to 5, but there is no explanation why. So that might be something for workplaces to kind of be open to, around being clearer around why the rules they have in place exist that allows for people to kind of then work around it if needed. Chanelle, you did mention that it was quite hard for you to find a job. I believe you told me that it takes 5 years for you to finally get the job that you do have. What was the barrier for you in those years, and what do you think in general is the biggest barriers that prevents autistic people from being employed?
Yeah, so when we do our education employment presentations, we break things into 5 categories. So there's advertising, interviewing, onboarding, accommodations, and ongoing support. And there are barriers in every single one of those areas. So for me, a big challenge was navigating the advertisements. There were times where I would apply for a job because it was 30 hours or so, but they didn't put the days. And then I would get the call with them and ask me why the heck I applied if I can't work Wednesdays. And I'm like, well, you're open 7 days a week, so how was I supposed to know? Other things were challenges with requirements. So some things would say, requires the ability to think laterally. And I go, how do you think sideways? And then I don't apply. So yeah, bits and pieces like that, or they don't mention everything. So I'm allergic to a lot of cleaning products, but you might have a job as a trampoline park attendant and they don't mention the cleaning aspect of it. They just talk about being a park attendant. And then you apply and waste your time because you can't actually do the cleaning aspect of the job. So struggle with that. And then you get to interviews. Often they don't give you the questions ahead of time. The questions can be quite vague. So they might ask things like, what are your strengths and weaknesses? And being quite literal, my first response would be, I'm afraid of the dark and I have asthma, so I'd be pretty useless in a war. Or strengths, I don't really know how to answer that question in a work setting. Why do you want the job? Because I need money. You know, interviews are not well set up for someone who's going to interpret things quite literally, or for a person who has gaps in their workplace experience. So you might have questions like, tell me about a time you managed a conflict. What if you didn't have a conflict? I had a time where I was asked, why did you leave your previous job? And the reason I'd left was because my manager told me that work and study needed to come before my well-being and kept putting me on shifts when I'd given weeks warning that I had appointments. And I didn't agree with that opinion. But you can't say that in an interview. You can't be bashing your old managers. And I didn't really know how to navigate that. When I did get jobs, I was a bit too blunt for them. I didn't last very long. I asked lots of questions. I had one job where I was asking questions and their response was, I'm testing you. And I kind of freaked out because I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm doing and I don't want to do it wrong. The communication really gets in the way. The sensory things get in the way. I struggled with the overwhelming environment in a lot of places. I also often forgot when I had interviews because they would just tell me over the phone that I had this date and time, and I would forget. They never followed it up in writing. A lot of issues. And I was pretty burnt out at the time, and so I needed a job that was going to be flexible. And when I started this job, I was working 8 hours initially, and I could choose when and where I did that. And I've been able to extend my hours quite a bit since then. I'm very efficient at my job. I think recognizing that people have potential even if they have the gaps. I mean, I'm a 2-time best-selling author, and I struggled to get a job. So, yeah, it's hard to have those skills recognized when you don't have the experience to back it up.
I think ironically, the job ad that says, can you think laterally? Like probably you would have been great for that job because you would think in a way that, as you said, most people wouldn't. But that makes sense. You know, I guess in sharing your very personal experience, what do you want changed? You know, like what would make life easier and better for you and others like you if it was different in the process?
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard for a lot of us feeling like we're useless and failures in society because we can't get past that recruitment stage. And then a lot of people will just go and study more. They'll have several qualifications, but not the experience to back it up. I think that takes a very big toll on us mentally. For me, I mean, all I wanted to do is help people. So it's been great for me having a job. And yeah, if people are more understanding right from the get-go, that's great. When we worked with the police, we did the neurodiversity employment program. We got rid of interviews entirely. Instead, we did a workshop where people got to demonstrate their skills, and our participants found that more positive because even if they didn't get the job, they saw who they were up against. And so, you know, it didn't feel as personal or bad when they didn't get it. I forgot what the question was.
Yeah, and I think with that, when you're looking at accommodating or changing, say, that recruitment process or looking at those workplace accommodations, a lot of people might get put off thinking that that's going to require a lot more work. But I think time and again you see that it's that initially it might be a bit to work out how to do that or how to change things, but in the long run, it's probably actually going to work out better for everyone.
It benefits everyone, I think.
In the example of how we work together, a lot of, and Chanelle was kind of talking about that in terms of, we go through each of the tasks and break that down. But that's really helped me to become more clear in how I communicate. Well, I hope getting clearer and breaking things down like into step by step. But when it comes to then training up new staff and putting processes in place, it's actually led to lots of efficiencies down the line where, I've had to do that once, but now we can reuse that. And all of the staff, whether they're neurodivergent or not, are like, oh, this is great. It's so easy to follow. And, they just pick up and know what they have to do. So that little bit of effort initially pays off to longer term kind of efficiencies and supports all staff, not just the autistic staff member or neurodivergent staff member.
I think once you recognise that interviews are not a good measure of who's the best applicant, but rather the best actor and ability to follow the script, you can be more willing to look at changing the process because you might actually get people who are going to do a far better job for you.
100%. It keeps coming back down to why are the rules we have in place or the processes we have in place? What are you trying to achieve?
Because a lot of the time it just feels like you're lying. There are certain things you can say, you should say, shouldn't say. You're supposed to portray a particular version of yourself that may not be the honest version of yourself and your skills.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to acknowledge the point that you made, Chanelle, about when you finally got a job, how rewarding it was for you because you felt like you were a contributing member of society, you were helping people. So maybe can you share a little bit of the upsides of workplaces that has integrated neurodiverse individuals, including autistic people, well, and what are the benefits you have seen from that?
So, the first really important thing is to make sure you're not applying different standards to neurodivergent people. I think sometimes people think that if they hire neurodivergent people, they're going to have these amazing skills and it's going to be great for their workplace. And then when that person doesn't meet those really high standards, they're not happy. So just a first note. But yes, neurodivergent people can have different strengths. One of the things we've seen that's been quite positive in a lot of places is that when you adjust your communication for autistic people, you make communication clear organisation-wide. It's easier for people to understand what's expected and, what they're doing. Definitely you'll find more creative solutions to things if you're not having everyone thinking the same way. Sometimes you have more efficient processes, and I've definitely changed quite a few things here to be like, this is too long and wordy. Let's make it easier to understand.
And very logical. Yeah, you can't argue that. That definitely makes sense. Let's do that.
I think there's a lot that neurodivergent people can bring that helps. A lot of us are very loyal and honest and will always show up. For me, I will almost never take time off because it's part of my routine to be at work. And I work quite efficiently. Depends on the person's strengths. If they're put in a place of interest, they can be really, really quick and thorough and do a really good job of what they're doing.
Yeah, and I think that's again kind of highlights that in those workplaces where you can be flexible to be kind of matching that, like when that's the way we work as a team is kind of thinking about each person's interests or like areas of expertise and things and assigning those people to it because we know that that's where we're going to get good productivity and people are going to enjoy what they're working on.
So if I'm given a task that I know I'm not going to be particularly fast at or I'm just not interested, I communicate that and it's given to someone who will do it better than I will.
And, obviously we work in a very collaborative workplace at Clearhead, and it's something that increasingly more workplaces need to be able to do because the world is complex. Generally not one person or one team will be able to solve a problem. And so we've talked about how there is benefits about different ways of seeing the world or doing things that will then help foster that innovation with that problem solving. So how then do you also manage that conflict? For example, you mentioned that autistic people can be a bit more direct. And so for some people who are maybe not as confrontational, that can be quite challenging to be interacting with someone who is more direct. And so then that causes interpersonal issues. So how do you navigate that space of conflict management in the context of the diversity of employees?
I found that conflict is actually not inevitable. I think if you go into a space assuming there's going to be conflict, there's probably going to be conflict. But generally, the only conflict I've been involved in work and seen others involved in is when there's been a lack of understanding of the neurodiverse differences. So when I say that we're a bit more direct, it might be instead of asking how someone is and doing all the small talk, I just go up and tell them something. I have once told my boss that someone thought he was narcissistic. He understands I was not being mean or being rude. I was just stating something someone said. So I think, having a bit of that understanding, but also recognizing that we're all humans. And if you're hurt by something, communicate that. It doesn't, just because someone's autistic doesn't mean that they are void of accountability. So if I said something to someone that hurt them because I was quite direct, I wouldn't be offended if they came and talked to me about that and I could explain, I'm just direct and I will, I'll be a bit more careful about what I say to that person. It's not going to mean that I'm going to start putting extra fluff and sugarcoating things, but I will be aware that certain things could upset that person.
Yeah, and I think that, the two key things there is it's that you're kind of fostering that environment where people listen to the different perspectives and try and understand from different perspectives, take that on board and kind of work from there. And, that you can then also give a different perspective to things. But it's about being open to hearing what the other person's saying, getting a better understanding, and then, it might be adjusting things. Or, if you find, say I find Chanelle being blunt difficult, I know it's also not a personal thing. But like you were saying, Chanelle, if I was feeling upset about it, it's about, that you're building up enough of a relationship that I could then say something.
Yeah. I think going into things assuming there is no ill intent can be very helpful. There have been times where I've accidentally insulted people. I'll say things like, oh, you've got split ends, and they take that as an insult. Whereas for me, I'm just stating a fact. I'm not meaning anything else with it. There's no implication behind my words. I'm saying what I'm saying. That's it.
Yeah. And I like as well, Chanelle, your call out that, if you are hurt by what someone said to you, to just have the conversation and, and not just assume ill intent. Larah, you talked about having to be, as a manager, be more mindful of the accommodations that Chanelle needed. What are common accommodations or strategies that managers or people leaders should be aware of when supporting or managing autistic employees?
I think for us it's what's always helpful is those sort of regular check-ins. And for us it's always evolving, or it might something might trail off, but then we kind of come back and say, okay, how's this working? How can we adjust things? And in terms of working with autistic employees, key is around that communication and those communication preferences, and where me just explaining something, say there's a task or something that we need to start working on, me just verbally explaining it might not be enough, and that actually then it's important to also write that out, so that that helps with that processing, for example. And then also in terms of kind of like writing down all the things that we're working on to then actually help with that prioritizing and looking at, okay, what's the highest priority and so on. And I guess unfortunate in our situation as well, then it's bi-directional thing because we work together, that's my work too. And so then we're kind of both looking at, okay, across the team, what are our priorities?
I think it's also really important for managers of disabled and neurodivergent people to be willing to learn and don't take it personally if they tell you you're doing something unhelpful. So, I mean, you don't know what you don't know, right? There've been times when Larah's given me tasks and I've not understood it at all, and I've had to go back and forth, and it's been frustrating. But, we've gotten there in the end, and she's not offended if I'm like, you're doing a bad job of this.
And I think, for me, I take that as a way to improve my communication, and that's what I was saying earlier as well, that then helps, across the board. So now, like I'm better at then breaking tasks down into smaller steps and writing that out, like writing out kind of how-to guides and things so that, a certain job works for someone. And then we can keep reusing that as a resource, as guidance for future employees as well. And so actually it's creating a lot of efficiencies down the track in terms of onboarding of new staff and so on.
Would you, along those lines, because as you mentioned, Chanelle, that experience was frustrating for you. Are there things that people do that we should avoid that could unintentionally cause discomfort or stress for autistic employees or co-workers?
Definitely there's like certain phrases that are annoying, like, but you don't look autistic, or if you do this thing, you can overcome your autism. Anything about fixing or curing, or saying, but you're so normal, kind of really minimizing it. But it comes from a place of good intentions where you're trying to say, you're not that different, but it's actually really invalidating for a lot of us. Other things would be like, don't touch people without asking. If you're coming to get their attention, don't tap them on the shoulder. Autistic people might not like that too much. Recognizing that autistic people can really struggle with interruptions. So it might be that instead of constantly coming to them in person to talk to them, you might message them so that they can choose when to look at that, so that they're not being distracted from their tasks and struggling to get back to it.
That makes sense. I mean, a lot of what we have been discussing requires in some ways some knowledge from the workplace or from the employer, manager, people leader. What is the best place to go, or any tips you have to help HR or managers to understand these different types of neurodiverse conditions, and then ensure that they can sort of act appropriately in consideration of that?
Yeah, I think over the last 4 or 5 years, we've definitely seen also an increase in organisations wanting to become more inclusive and to get a better understanding. And so with that, we provide employment education programs. So, we go to different workplaces and do a, 1 or 2 hour presentation for the whole workforce around, all of what we're talking about today, really. And then there's also kind of opportunities for more in-depth work with, for example, HR managers, things like that. And there's various different organisations that do that kind of organisation kind of wide support, as well as then, for example, we've got a very small contract from MSD to support autistic adults into employment, and to provide some of that in-work support on a kind of individualised level. And there's lots of, we're developing our own resources for workplaces and things, but there's lots of resources and kind of trainings out there online as well.
That makes sense. Chanelle, one of the things that you said can be, I guess, invalidating is to kind of make assumptions or make comments that are unhelpful. But what if, for example, the autistic employee maybe are not either aware or comfortable asking for additional support, and you can see them struggling and you want them to take that additional support? What's the best way to go about it?
So instead of asking them, how can I help you? Or trying to get them to ask for help, offer specific things. So say, would it be helpful if I talk to you more directly and less metaphors? Would it be helpful if there was a quiet place for you to go? And then in terms of supporting employees who feel like they have to mask, I think you can create safe places for them to be themselves. So one organization we did some education for, one of the things they have in place is kind of a quiet zone where if you sit in particular seats, no one is allowed to talk to you. So it's things like that where you recognize the different needs people might have and making it in an organization-wide accommodation so that they know that in those spaces, they're safe to just be themselves.
And if they're seeing, if organisations are, say, for example, doing an education program or opening up, a session for all staff, then it's showing that they're wanting as an organisation to have this understanding and to be making these accommodations to be inclusive. Different organisations often also set up like specific neurodiversity groups or kind of support networks. Things like that can be really helpful to then be seeing that you're working in a safe place and in that way maybe that might slowly help you feel like you can kind of unmask.
The police brought out fidget toys for their whole team. Mostly the neurotypicals used it, but
always.
It creates this thing that's allowed for everyone, not just for autistic people. For me, masking means hiding every aspect of my neurodivergence. It means I'm constantly aware of every gesture I'm making, the tone of my voice, the order of the words coming out of my mouth, how what facial expressions I have, what emotions I'm portraying, how long it's been since I looked away from the person, have I been staring at them, have I been looking away too long? Everything is a conscious process when I'm masking. And that becomes very exhausting and makes it very difficult to focus on anything else. It means I can't listen to the conversations. I can't process anything, can't do my work. Reducing the need for masking can have a very positive impact.
Another thing that I guess is something that is done organization-wide, Larah, is around performance evaluation. And we've just talked about how that there are different strengths, and sometimes these performance evaluations might not take into account those different strengths and capabilities. What are your suggestions to organizations to have more inclusive performance evaluations?
Yeah, I think it's important, to be presuming that competence and that it's not something that, something from autism that then, it might be in some situations that then people think you're not going to be performing in certain ways because of the autism.
Be careful not to be paying more attention to someone just because they're disabled. Like I've been in situations where my managers started micromanaging me because they know I'm autistic and they don't trust me to do my job the same as everyone else. It's important to treat everyone the same and assume that they're competent at their job. Don't look for issues just because they're different. And
then at the same time, and this is with everyone, it's about getting to know that individual on that individual level, understanding their strengths and then areas of challenge. And then if they do happen to be particular things related to the condition, it's about then thinking, okay, well, how can we accommodate that? What sorts of things could we be putting in place to be supporting in that respect? So say with, if it's around communication.
An example might be someone's not understanding their tasks and so they're consistently doing it wrong. The answer shouldn't be to punish them. It should be to adjust your communication.
So how can I communicate more clearly to make that task more understandable? And so it's always that, thinking of it in terms of that kind of bi-directional nature.
We started off the conversation talking about how important being part of an autistic community is, and even just understanding what are the needs that you have. And you briefly mentioned, Larah, about creating groups or social groups for specific communities in the workplace. What's your experience around creating a group for neurodivergent or autistic employees? And and what are the pros and cons of doing that?
I think it's important for the neurodivergent employees to be the ones leading that and setting that up in a way that works for them. So, for example, we have that in process here at Autism New Zealand. But for me, it's really important that as the manager, I don't come in and say, I think you should have this group. I think you should meet once a week and do it like this. It's for those employees that feel like that would be helpful for them, that they have that opportunity, and that then together they can kind of co-create what that looks like and what they'd like to get out of it. And then it's for, like management and HR to see how they can support that. They might have certain requests that, you can accommodate, but they might also have some where, you don't have the resources or you don't have the funding to do that. And then it's kind of looking at, okay, well, what could we do instead, or how could we go about it?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, in the context that I believe, Chanelle, you had mentioned, you don't work, for example, a full 40-hour week. And one of the questions from someone from the community was that, they feel because they have autism that they need to take more sick leave due to being sensory overwhelmed and feeling burnt out. Is there any consideration or accommodation that workplaces need to think about in that context?
So I think the reality is, if you're working in a workplace that is not understanding and accommodating of autism, you're going to burn out, especially if you're working full-time. I think it's helpful if the manager or employer can understand that when you're burnt out, you're not going to be as effective as your job. But that minor accommodations can make a huge difference and prevent that from becoming the case. I think, when you can recognize that things like headphones or slightly adjusting communication can mean that you have an employee who's much more effective at their job, it's not that big a deal to adjust those things. And I hate talking about it this way, but in terms of money, it's better for you as an employer to make those minor adjustments than keep paying to have someone do a job when they're burnt out and probably not doing it as well as they could. And I only say it that way because that's really a lot of what employers are thinking about. For the individual themselves, figuring out what you need is really helpful. Sometimes you might be able to advocate for flexible working options, so working from home versus working in the workplace, and that might help with sensory overwhelm. You might be able to have a conversation about what you're wearing, or being able to wear headphones, or changing how you communicate with people, and that can have a very big impact. In terms of the earplugs, yes, loop earplugs can help with noise distraction. For people who struggle with noise sensitivity, a long-term, all-day option that's helpful is the calmer earplugs.
That's really great. Well, we like to end these things with one question. What is your one wellbeing practice that you do to stay well, Chanelle and Larah?
For me, it's getting out into nature. I live near the beach, so ocean swims. Yeah.
For me, it's implementing a sensory diet. So if I know I'm going to be in a stimulating environment, I will always have quiet downtime before and after.
That's it for today's episode. If you want to learn more about how Clearhead can support your workplace, or you have a burning mental health question that you'd like us to explore on the podcast, check us out at myclearhead.com and drop us a message. Love our content? Share it with a friend or leave us a comment on LinkedIn, Instagram, or Facebook. Thank you so much again for listening, and catch you on the next one.